Well, Bev, we know that the federal government made some minor adjustments which are mainly about the terms and the timing on which they will designate or name a big tech company as having failed to negotiate a code, an agreement with Australian media companies, and therefore need to be made subject to the mandatory code of conduct. So the actual code itself and the processes and the mandatory nature of it, none of that has changed. The much bigger concession has come from Facebook, which has essentially capitulated and essentially has now agreed to come back to do what it said it would not, which is to sit down with the Australian media companies and negotiate terms for compensating them for the use of their news and their other output.
Was it the fact that, that Australia was the tough guy, or was it the fact that Facebook discovered that it wasn't universally as loved as it might have thought it was?
Well, I think it's both parts of that equation, Bev. I think that the Australian government made clear it was not going to move, and in fact, Google had already signed up to the terms of the agreement. But second, that, as you say, Facebook perhaps discovered it had less international support, less public support than it realised. A senior member of the Australian government said to me, these guys are in a bubble of their own existence. They think everybody loves them. What they don't see is that they are, in fact, the big tobacco companies of 10 and 20 years ago.
That is such an interesting analogy. Talking of finding themselves increasingly unpopular, China continues to rail against any resistance, but Canada's parliament took a very interesting stand overnight. Tell us a little bit about what they did.
Yes, the House of Representatives in Canada passed overwhelmingly, in fact, by a vote of 266 to 0, a non-binding motion which declares that the Chinese government is guilty of a policy of genocide in the province of Xinjiang against its Uyghur Muslim population, and that the Canadian government should call for the relocation of next year's Winter Olympics away from Beijing to another country. Now, the government of Canada, the executive government, the Prime Minister and ministers, didn't take a side in this particular vote. They abstained from the vote altogether. But apart from the ministers, the 37 ministers and Prime Minister of Canada, every member of the House, government and opposition, supported that motion.
And it is an interesting one in terms of how one does push back against what is happening in Xinjiang, and China feels it is immune to criticism, immune to people taking a stand against it. Is this kind of step something that needs to be universally thought of a little bit more to try and to get China to face up to its actions?
Well, the Chinese government thought that it had impunity from the Western world from the beginning because, as John Bolton, the National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, disclosed in his memoir, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, actually told Donald Trump in advance that he was planning to create these enormous so-called re-education camps that the Uyghurs themselves called concentration camps, and Donald Trump encouraged Xi Jinping to go ahead. Now, Xi Jinping therefore thought that he had impunity, so he proceeded. And it's been a very slow but definite process of the Western world, the democratic world, really beginning to first accept and second criticise this policy. And now we see a more concerted effort to apply pressure. We saw in the last couple of days the British government demanding that the UN be given access to Xinjiang by the Chinese government. We see this vote on the floor of the Canadian House. We see the US government, both Trump and now under Biden, designating China as guilty of genocide. So those declarations then are a precursor to taking sanctions and more action. And on the commercial level, we see companies around the world, for example, boycotting cotton exports and products from Xinjiang. So it's the beginning, I think, of a harder line against this policy of the Chinese government.
Do you think it played into the lack of enthusiasm that a lot of European countries showed for a conference that they try to hold on their Belt and Road Initiative, China?
Yes, it has been one of the factors. I think the effort that you're referring to, Bev, was an attempt to convene what has been just an annual event now since 2012 between China and 17 countries of Central Europe and Eastern Europe. It's called the 17 plus 1, 17 Europeans, 1 is China. Xi Jinping called the summit. 6 of the country's leaders refused to attend, and they didn't even have to travel. It was a virtual summit, but they refused to attend. And this is largely because they've been disappointed at the failure of the Chinese government to follow through on promises made under its Belt and Road Initiative, its enormous international infrastructure project. The idea with the Central and Eastern European countries was that China would roll infrastructure, roads, rail, electricity plants and everything else through those countries, driving China's access, commercial and political, into the core countries of Europe. Well, 6 of these countries have stayed away now, disappointed that China hasn't followed through on its promises, snubbing Xi Jinping and his summit. And the Xinjiang, Hong Kong human rights questions have been a factor, but the biggest factor for these countries has been the failure of China to deliver, in dollar terms, market access and infrastructure promises.
Great to talk as always, Peter. Thanks so much.
Pleasure, Bev.